new college football playoff rankings are out, pretty much status quo. Huge games coming this weekend that might separate the pack a bit. And what's new at Michigan? This is the College Game Day Podcast for Wednesday, November 8th. Rece Davis and Pete Thamel with you. So, Pete, let's start with the latest news, which is that there wasn't a lot of news with the latest version of the college football playoff rankings coming out. And as suspected, it pretty much stayed the same. I thought Georgia might move to number one. In fact, I thought they would move to number one, and they didn't. And that's fine. As I said on the show last night, I think any case that is made for any of the teams ranked 1 through 5, perfectly legitimate. I think they're as closely grouped as any season I can remember at this point in the year. And you can even all the way go down to number 8 and nothing moved from a week ago.
Yeah, I really agreed with you, Rece. I thought a top 15 SEC team, quite frankly, the kind of team Georgia hadn't played this year. And look, they beat them. It was a good game. I thought Missouri played really well. It was an entertaining game. And, Georgia needed a field goal in the last 7 minutes to put away, essentially ice a game against a good team at home. But that was the caliber of opponent that Georgia had really lacked at this point in the schedule, in part because that Oklahoma game got pulled because of the SEC move. So I thought that there may be some inclination to nudge the Bulldogs up. I don't have a huge problem that they didn't. I did in watching the show, obviously, and then reading Boo Corrigan's comments after. There was some respect for Rutgers, that may not have been there as a league road victory in years past. They have a top 20 defense. They played really well in that first half. Control, like they had the underdog game plan, right? You control the ball, you let the other team make a mistake or two, you run it, you run the clock, and they made it a game for 3 quarters. So I felt like Ohio State got a measure of validity for that win that may not have been there in years past when Rutgers was in the Floodian era.
One thing that I've noticed in this, and I'm not at all saying that the SEC is not getting any respect, because they do have 3 teams in the top 9 in the country and 5 of the top 14. But in years past, fans of other conferences have felt as if it has gotten undue respect. I would differ with that. I think that most of the years of the playoff era, the level of play in the SEC has been, by and large, better than in the other conferences. Doesn't mean that every team in the SEC is better than every team in other conferences. I'm just saying that overall, the level of play has been higher. Mm-hmm. Based on the non-conference performance this year, that has not been the case. Based on football judgment of watching the games, I don't think that's the case. And that has been reflected by this committee, which I think validates some credibility that the committee should have had before, in my judgment. Not that you're going to agree with every decision they make, but by and large, credible. And I think the way that they're not bumping Georgia up because they finally won a game. They don't have Alabama ahead of Oregon, despite what some would deem a better resume. So, and because the resume is built largely on beating SEC teams, which has not proven to be as big a differentiating factor as it has been in previous years. So, I think the committee has, up to this point, has done a really good job, and they potentially have an impossible task depending on how the rest of the season plays out. If these teams at the top right now, obviously Ohio State and Michigan end up playing each other, so both of them are not going to be undefeated. But you could wind up with with a really difficult decision for that last spot at the end of the line. And, so far, I think they've shown pretty good credibility in getting to this point.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Rece, right? Because if we've all kind of operated on the Big Ten teams winning at home. Now, I don't think Penn State is going to win this weekend. They could, and they may, when Michigan goes there. But if Ohio State does lose to Michigan in Ann Arbor, which, I think Michigan will be a 3.5 point favorite in that game.
Yeah, probably. So somewhere in that line,
3-5, maybe something like that. I think they will be. They will be favored again, pending results previously. it would be pretty interesting to see how the committee treats Ohio State, considering they've treated them very well so far. Now, there's dozens of results that are going to factor in all different ways before that point. But I would think they'd have to feel pretty good there, being 1 instead of 3 right now, knowing that they have a tall task going to Michigan and playing a really, really good Michigan team.
Yeah, it's an exercise in futility to start saying, well, what if this happens? Yes, what if that happens? Sure. And and we had a really a good discussion on the show last night with Greg McElroy on the topic of consistency. Yeah, and Greg believes that there is some inconsistency that has been shown because Ohio State is number one. And the number one thing you need to point out, and he also was pointing out that he felt that Texas and Alabama had better resumes than Oregon did, but that Ohio State was getting rewarded based on its resume, which it almost certainly is. And Boo Corrigan has said as much. But the one thing that I would hasten to point out, if you look at Greg's personal rankings, he's got Oregon 6, and he's got Ohio State 5, if memory serves, because to him, football judgment is the ultimate arbiter and the number one thing that should be considered. So he uses his football judgment, which some call the eye test. I prefer football judgment to rank the teams. And that's what you want from a committee. So where I would differ with Greg on terms of consistency of the committee is that consistency for a committee is one of two things. I don't know any other way around it. You either have to have a formula or you have to have 13 or this week 12 people engage in groupthink. And the reason that we have the committee is to get varied perspectives. So there almost inherently will be some discrepancy, some conflict, as they like to use the term, at the margins, because if you have 13 people and you're asking them to bring their football judgment and their evaluation skills into question, you don't want them looking at things precisely the same way. So there are going to be some things that don't line up precisely. So, and that was why I challenged Greg and said, maybe you want a formula. And to his credit, he's like, yeah, I'd take a formula, because even if you got 13 old coaches in there, they're all not going to agree. I mean, we see that when we talk to coaches all the time. So, any kind of, conspiracy thing or anything like that when people complain about the rankings, just sort of a dead fish smell to me. So I'm not really up for that, but because things are going to change and play out for the rest of the way here. Hey, let's before we dive into this week and the games, which are of the utmost importance, let's talk a little bit about Michigan, which I know. Hey, guess what? They're going to talk about Michigan on the College Game Day podcast again. But every time we come on, there's some new twist. The latest twist being that other schools, Purdue, Ohio State, and Rutgers had engaged in swapping some information, which they'd given out Michigan signals, which a lot of Michigan people on the social media machines have taken as a point of validation, completely ignoring the fact, to at least based on what has been reported up to this point, that it's not the same thing. Now, it may be a little sketch. It may seem a little low rent, ganging up on everybody. But the fact of the matter is, you and I have been in these buildings for years. This happens, man. Everybody has buddies that they've worked together with. And now maybe they don't send a call sheet. So maybe in some people's judgment, that is beyond the pale. But, this is not, Jack Sales sending the playbook to Ron Zook, when he was on staff at Tennessee and sending it to Florida or whatever that story was, a long time ago. This is information sharing. And I'm not saying even that should happen or that it's the best look for those involved, but information sharing goes on all the time. And if you want to say that violates a sportsmanship policy, go ahead. I mean, that's not an unreasonable take. But to say that it is the same thing and therefore somehow vindicates Michigan's actions, alleged actions, Connor Stallion's actions, is preposterous in my judgment.
Yeah, Rece, I think the important thing here is the line of delineation between legal and illegal, right? Like Connor Stalions allegedly ran a wide-ranging scheme that broke two tenets of NCAA rules. One is in-person opponent scouting. They went to future opponents' stadiums and scouted games. There's evidence of that. There's a long paper trail of it. It's been a rule that's been in place for 30 years or so. And there's beginning to become more evidence of the people in those seats using electronics to scout the games, which again is not allowed under NCAA rules. So those two things make these completely different conversations. And I think ultimately what I've gleaned in the last 24 hours is that the Big Ten isn't really going to put a lot of time and thought into the Rutgers, Purdue, Ohio State version of this. Like, they collected the information, but it's really just for being viewed as a diversionary tactic to what happened. And what happened was Connor Stalions ran an unprecedented, wide-ranging, as it's been alleged, scheme to give Michigan an illegal schematic advantage. And that hasn't changed. And that is ultimately what Tony Petitti is going to make his decision based on. We're expected to hear one this week, maybe as early as Thursday. And that's the crux of it. And I think it's important from the Big Ten's perspective that since all this was alleged, and again, they have a chance to formally respond on Wednesday, there hasn't been anything that's been a mitigating factor or anything that said, no, this actually wasn't the case. Like, there's been nothing that I've heard from Michigan, and maybe you've heard different, that says, no, this wide-ranging, elaborate alleged scheme wasn't run as it's been alleged. So I think that is the core of what this Big Ten decision is going to be based on. And I will say this about the story, and Larry Leitch from the Associated Press broke it the other day. I think it was about Tuesday, 48 hours ago. I thought it was very interesting, Rece. Like, we spend a lot of time covering football, and anytime we get a window into how the world really works, I think it's very interesting, right? That, okay, Purdue's going to play in the Big Ten title game, and there's a guy on the Purdue staff who's calling people on different staffs, and the level of detail by the end of the season that they've been able to gather. I thought it was a really insightful look at how, a little peek under the hood at how football really works. So I think it was relevant in the sense that it informed us all of something that I'd imagine most viewers, readers, listeners don't know, that every staff has a sign stealer, essentially, and they don't know how that information is disseminated. And there was a quote somebody put up yesterday. It's a friend, an enemy of your enemy is a friend of yours, something like that. Like, there's that whole that whole mentality that permeates through these leagues, and everybody is scurrying for an edge on the margins. And that's what this was an interesting window into. But in terms of comparing them, I think that's disingenuous.
It's it's one of those things that you kind of look at and you don't want to think it happens. But I was having a conversation with a coach a few weeks ago about an old game from years ago, and they had some success against a really high-powered team. And he said, yeah, so-and-so called me a couple of weeks after that because they had to play him and said, okay, what was it that you tried to do? And they talked about the scheme that they used. And then the team that tried to employ it the second time was not nearly as successful at trying to take some of those tenets. But that type of thing, happens all the time. Now, and the thing is, you can say that that's unsavory, and perhaps it is. That's probably, not a wild take to say that they shouldn't do that, but it's impossible to legislate that. The other is pretty easy to legislate. You can't send people to games. You can't videotape their signals. So basically, I know this is not the direct quote, but I looked this up for you because I know what a pop culture maven you are.
Oh, ninja, yeah.
Dwight Schrute of The Office fame actually had a similar quote about his rival friend Jim, saying, Jim is my enemy, but it turns out that Jim is also his own worst enemy, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Jim is actually my friend. But because he's his own worst enemy, the enemy of my friend is my enemy. So actually, Jim is my enemy. So there you go.
Maybe Dwight Schrute can come and fix all this.
He would have as good a shot as anybody now.
Just be an arbiter for fairness, Dwight.
The one thing, Pete, and we had a little brief conversation before we started the podcast about this. I've reached the point, and this is going to shock many of our good friends who are convinced that we are somehow against Michigan, that everybody's against Michigan, Michigan against the world, all of that stuff. I don't think Harbaugh should be suspended.
Huh.
I think that if it is within the purview of the Big Ten, and I'm not clear, I know the thing about the level of the fines. If it's over 10,000, it's major, and all of that. I think the more effective punishment for this, if it is deemed that the Big Ten thinks that the actions have risen to the level that command punishment, the more effective punishment would be to withhold revenue disbursement to a significant level, whatever they deem that to be. And for the members of the coaching staff, Harbaugh or whoever, shut down recruiting, shut down you can either limit the official visits. I don't know if it's within their purview. That might be an NCAA thing. But if possible, limit their contact with official visitors, whether they are on campus or away, maybe even shut down for a year, visiting players off campus. That will get somebody's attention about making sure that the ship is run. Now, there are coaches.
No hamburgers, Rece? Would it be the no hamburger?
Yeah, no hamburgers. Yeah, exactly.
Cheeseburger. I don't remember.
Yeah. There are coaches who would say, yeah, sign me up for that because I don't really want to go out for it. But what they don't want is to be prohibited from interacting with recruits when they come to campus. I don't think that's ever been done before. But as I was thinking through this, I was thinking, what's an appropriate punishment? What is one that would get their attention and not impact the competition on the field, which is what we say the major problem is to begin with, that stealing the signs impacted the competition on the field. If you suspend Jim Harbaugh for Saturday or for a couple Saturdays from now when they play Ohio State or even the game against Maryland in between, you are on some level impacting the competition on the field. And I'm not sure that's what you want to do because the ones who pay the price for that more than anyone else are the players. And while I understand those who are against Michigan would say they benefited from this because they were coached into knowing what was coming, I get that. But I think it's disproportionate. I think it's a disproportionate punishment to impact this team, these players on the field. I would say you impact the program and their ability to recruit and to make money off of this. There's no great answer because if Tony Petitti chooses not to suspend Jim, people are going to get mad. If he suspends him for one game, they're going to get mad that it's not enough. If they suspend him for 2 games and he comes back for Ohio State's going to be furious. If they suspend him for 3 games, Michigan's going to be furious. And, so it's hard to find the right proportion. And to me, if it is within the Big Ten rules and within the commissioner's purview, and, when Jim Delaney was commissioner, everything was within his purview. Jim could have done whatever he wanted to do. I think that would be something that would be more of a deterrent, and it might not send the external message that people who want a pound of flesh desire, but it certainly would send an internal message if they hit them hard in revenue distribution and recruiting. Do that, and you're going to get your point across.
Couple quick things to close the loop on this, Rece. One is I've seen some people talking about, vacating wins or banning them from the playoff, that kind of thing. I'm confident to say that's not going to happen.
Good.
The NCAA's ability to punish, and again, this is not an NCAA purview thing, we're talking Big Ten, but the NCAA has struggled with punishment, right? Like that's become a vexing issue for them, in part because the timelines of their investigations are so slow. One thing I've been told that I'm certain of is that they don't want to impact the players on this team. Now, again, taking a coach away may impact them, but like just directly ripping something from the players is not a punishment that I've been told is really even on the table for the upcoming weeks. When you go forward here, regardless of what the punishment is, seemingly it's going to be a suspension for Jim Harbaugh, the length of which is not determined yet. We're going to take this thing to court. The only certain prediction here, Rece, is that everyone's going to be unhappy. You just hinted at it, right? Like this is you have 2 divided sides, and You mentioned Jim Delaney had all this autonomy. I don't know if Jim Delaney or Henry Kissinger could get some middle ground right now. That because things are so divisive. So if it's X suspension deemed light, you're going to have both sides unhappy. You're going to have Michigan likely go try to get a temporary restraining order in I would think Washtenaw County State Circuit Court. And that seems to be where the legal seeds have been planted at this point. I will say this, thanks to a little research in one of our fearless readers, I do actually have two examples of the Big Ten being taken to legal action being taken to the Big Ten by its members. One is Nebraska during COVID, when Kevin Warren canceled the season. The players, 8 players, did a collective suit through a law firm in Omaha to bring them back. And that, like through the fog of all the COVID news, I just completely forgotten about. The other, one of our intrepid listeners emailed to me. It was a bright light in an email inbox that was filled with some darker things this week. He mentioned a really interesting story, and I went down a small rabbit hole on it. There was a Illinois quarterback in 1980 named Dave Wilson. Dave Wilson was deemed academically ineligible by the Big Ten, and they got an injunction. I read a UPI article, dateline Springfield, Illinois. I think it was the Illinois State Supreme Court that allowed Dave Wilson to play. And I think Illinois ended up getting in trouble for doing it in the long run. But we are not in unprecedented territory. I think I said to you the other day, rare if not unprecedented. So it's not unprecedented that these types of legal things have happened. So courts in Michigan are closed on Friday, which adds to the drama a little bit. It's Veterans Day. So how a temporary restraining order, does it go through County State Circuit Court in Washtenaw County, or does it go through federal court? I think is one of the looming questions. I would lean local, in part because Nebraska's was local, and that's probably a little bit of a roadmap for what the Michigan legal team would use to do this. So yes, when we started this season, TRO was not on my college football bingo card twice. Temporary restraining order. We saw one from the local court in Pullman. That judge, I just want to give him a hug. He seemed like a nice guy. In the county, I don't remember the name of the county outside Pullman, but the local judge got a temporary restraining order for Oregon State, Washington State on Pac-12 matters, and we are very likely to see the second TRO that could impact this season. The key phrase to take away, and I'm not going to bore you with all the legal stuff that I've dug into on this here, is irreparable harm is sort of the legal threshold to be proven here. And some really smart person, smarter than me certainly, could talk about irreparable harm on both ways for a while, but that will become the buzz term for the TRO to be heard. So, and that would cause an injunction that would allow Jim Harbaugh seemingly to coach this weekend if it gets escalated to that point, if he is indeed suspended. So fun times here.
Well, while I certainly would like to seek out some advice on where to get a bulky vacuum cleaner I have repaired, or if there's any type of LLC that I could check out involving Blake Corum and Connor Stallions, which, by the way, is another bizarre twist. Just because I referenced it, let me say Blake Corum said he had no idea there's some LLC in Wyoming that Stallions allegedly had connected Blake Corum's name to. I mean, it's just theater of the absurd, from him dressing up like Jacques Clouseau on the sideline over there. And, it's just a crazy thing. And, Corum has his lawyers on it, and good for him to shut that down as quickly as possible. We'd love to talk vacuum cleaner repair and LLC for the rest of the podcast, but instead we've got the great Bill Connelly joining us right now to talk on the field. Bill, vacuum cleaner repair aside, how I don't know if that factors into SP Plus. Michigan's like a 4.5 point favorite at Penn State. We went through the litany of difficulties that Penn State has had on this stage, oftentimes because they aren't favored, as they aren't on Saturday. So how do you evaluate what's going to happen Saturday, or what you expect to happen on Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing we can say is that Michigan doesn't appear to be distracted. Technically, I guess they didn't look quite as good against Purdue as they had, quite as merciless as they had in previous games, but I think they're fine. It's so funny trying to poke holes in the on-field Michigan right now. And luckily in my job, I get to mostly focus on the games that will be played and not all the stuff that's happening elsewhere. But I basically, you look at matchups, Michigan wins them all right now because their stats are so good overall, and because they're just, even when you adjust for opponent, they've been good. So basically what I'm trying to do for my Friday preview is go to the old trope of, okay, if an upset happens, how did it happen? That's usually good for at least figuring out a couple things. Number one, I think the best thing that Penn State has going for them is they are the best turnovers team in the country, both because they force them and because they can probably get some third down sacks on JJ McCarthy if they ever get a third down. I mean, they have to stop the run better than they did last year when Michigan rushed for 400 yards, but their pass rush is awesome. Even if Chop Robinson isn't 100%, they had like 6 sacks last week without him. If they can force some turnovers, they got a pick 6 last year against Michigan that kept that game closer than it should have been. And I think that's the number one path right there. If they can win that turnover, if they can get +2 in the turnover battle, that kind of evens out a lot of things. Beyond that, I'm not real sure. Michigan does give you some big plays occasionally. Any successful play you get is probably a decent sized one, and they aren't the most explosive offense in the country. So maybe Penn State's complete and total lack of explosiveness doesn't bite them entirely. This is going to be kind of a ball control game, you figure. And if they can stay in third and mediums and avoid getting hit by big plays on the other side, maybe they can kind of keep the field position game under control. But that's kind of the only path I see. It's Michigan's really, really, really good, and Penn State's going to have to play pretty error-free ball and get at least a +2, I think, in the turnover margin to give themselves a really good chance.
How much of a factor, Bill, do you think it would be if Jim Harbaugh doesn't coach? Like, how does that get baked in? And I know it's hard with SP Plus, but it's a fascinating question, right? Because there was seemingly not much of a factor in games 1, 2, and 3 this year. I'm just curious how you view that.
I mean, if he's still coaching Sunday through Friday, I don't really put any stock into it all. Going back to Urban Meyer a few years ago when Ryan Day coached Saturdays, but he was still the coach the other 6 days of the week. It didn't really make any difference there. I guess they struggled with TCU a little bit that one game, but that I didn't see any sort of quantifiable difference. Now, Michigan didn't cover any of those games early in the season, so you could say they maybe weren't living up to projections or expectations or whatever, but that was usually because they had called off the dogs about halfway through the third quarter. So they handled their business just fine when the game was even reasonably close. So I'm not putting any stock in that. Their assistants are experienced. If you want to start suspending assistants too, things could get weird at some point down the line. But if it's just Harbaugh, I'm not doing anything with that, I don't think.
Okay.
Lane Kiffin and Kirby Smart have won national championships together, or a national championship together, know each other well. Lane, I would imagine, will have a trunk full of funk in that offense ready for Kirby's defense. But is Ole Miss a paper tiger?
I do love Lane Kiffin's funk. I think there's a lot to like about their explosiveness and all that. And I mean, Missouri made quite a few 20, 30-yard gains last week. And if they can do, I mean, obviously Ole Miss doesn't have Luther Burden, but they've still got a more explosive offense overall. So that does lend a little bit of hope to the fact that Ole Miss could keep things close. I do think Missouri was able to really do some damage against Georgia last week, primarily because they're a more physical team than Ole Miss. We know by now that if you can't match Georgia's physicality, nothing else matters. And Missouri's actually been able to do it pretty well the last couple of years. We don't know that Ole Miss can do that. Alabama wasn't even really in rhythm, and they beat Ole Miss by 2 touchdowns back in whenever that was, late September. And so really, I think that's the big question here. If they can, keep Jackson Dart able to look downfield because they're not in 3rd and 11 and the pass rush isn't overwhelming them or anything, then they'll have a chance, but they're going to have to be able to run the ball really well. It's a lot of burden of proof here for Ole Miss. They're a good team, but what they are good at isn't necessarily what tends to beat Georgia. They're going to have to be really good at in the trenches as well.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting inflection point for Ole Miss because I feel like 2 years in a row now they've sort of roared to the three-quarters pull of the season and then gone out like lambs. And so that I give them credit. Like there was opportunities to fold in that A&M game, and A&M is really good in the trenches, especially defensively. Yep. I think that's just they have elite talent there. Whether they're maximizing it or not is a whole other $77 million question. But you can't argue that they have dogs, pun intended. So I'm really curious to see Ole Miss, and again, in my Pepto-Bismol theory of picking games, I'm going to remain skeptical of Ole Miss sort of having the chutzpah in the trenches until they show me they have.
Yeah, I think turnovers are really, really important to Ole Miss, especially on defense, because they aren't great up front, but they've I think either tied or won the turnover battle in every single game, and if you give them 2 turnovers, they're going to end up playing pretty good defense. That's usually how that works, I guess. But Georgia hasn't committed a turnover in the last 2 games. That was key to beating Missouri last week. Was they had to win the turnover battle, and we'll see if they'll make those. They obviously made mistakes early in the year that allowed South Carolina and Auburn to stick around despite getting outgained by triple digits, but they're going to have to make a couple mistakes, you figure.
Another interesting game, I think, and one that could be a really important one for the college football playoff picture and just sort of a theme of the season, is USC at Oregon. I was a little taken aback by how big the line is in that game. I think when I last checked, it was 16.5. And I get it. I get it that SC's defense has been terrible. They've made the change at defensive coordinator. And one of the themes is, depending on what Caleb Williams decides to do in the postseason, the end of the Caleb Williams era in college football could come next week.
Yeah,
because they finished the season a little bit earlier than everyone else.
Week 0
on November 18th against UCLA. However, while there was the devastation and the heartbreak that you saw from SC after the loss to Washington the other night, all is not lost. If they win out, the meeting, huge task for sure, but if they upset Oregon and then beat UCLA, which doesn't seem to be very far-fetched, they most likely will get into the Pac-12 championship game, because the teams that they lose the tiebreaker to, one of their losses in conference is Washington, who's likely going to go and be the other team in it. Utah plays Washington. Oregon State still has huge games. They would have to win out. Now, there is a scenario where Oregon State, Arizona SC all went out, and Oregon State would get the nod in a tiebreaker in that scenario. But the most likely one is if USC wins this game and beats UCLA, that there will be another game to play. So the question I have for you, Bill, is this. Is there any chance, given what we've seen, that SC was a conscientious objector in rush defense against Dylan Johnson in Washington last week, and now you have Bucky Irving and a really physical group from Oregon coming in? What chances do you give SC of shaking things up this week?
Well, I mean, first of all, it bears mentioning that SP Plus adores Oregon, hates USC's defense, and still only has this as like a 13-point game. So that line does seem to have, I mean, if you think USC's just packed it in, then that's fine, but I don't think they have. And if you make a coordinator change like this, as often as not, maybe it gives you a very brief little boost. You can come up with a couple little tactics that the other team doesn't expect, force a couple mistakes or whatever, and overachieve at least slightly. So, I mean, you have Caleb Williams and maybe a couple of unexpected little tweaks on defense you're still going to need some breaks, because Oregon is awesome. And like you said, their run game, it really might be the best in the country and better than Washington's. So maybe that alone makes the difference, but they're still not that far. They weren't that far from beating Washington last week, and with the terrible defense and the soon to be fired DC. So yeah, it's not out of the realm of possibility at all. I'm going to go with Oregon because Oregon's awesome, but this wouldn't be the most surprising result in the world now.
I think there's a pretty compelling case, and we'll pick the game on Friday, Rece, but for USC to cover here, if only because, and Bill, you'd obviously have the numbers to back it up, but Oregon, and this is in my mind from being on the sideline for that Washington game, has a efficient offense that's effective, but I wouldn't call it like as dynamic as USC's offense. Like they will methodically and surgically pick you apart. They will run Bucky Irving down your throat. They'll use Ferguson, the tight ends. They have Troy Franklin, who's a very good receiver, but this isn't like a 4-vert shot offense that's all or nothing. It's a churn offense. And that's not an insult to it. Offenses are designed in different ways, and it's effective for how Dan Lanning wants to play. So they could blow you out by 2 touchdowns and USC could still cover if that makes sense. I also think what we saw in that Oregon-Washington game is that there's some vulnerabilities in Oregon secondary. And USC still has Caleb Williams, and they still have very capable receivers. So I would be really surprised if USC went up there and laid an egg on offense. Now, I could see Oregon scoring on like 6 of 8 possessions, right? Like that's not. I don't think Oregon's going to punt a whole lot on Saturday unless something really dynamically changes with the effort in USC's defense. But you could see this thing come home at 35-21 or whatever, and not be crazy or 40 42-31 or something like that kind of score where Oregon controls the game. It's never really in doubt, but USC still ends up covering that number.
Yeah, their run explosiveness is high, but their passing explosiveness, which is obviously where most of your chunk plays tend to come, it's pretty mediocre. Let's see, 14% of their completions go for 20-plus yards. That's 97th in the country. It's a nibble kind of offense. And they have the game breakers to take one of those nibbles and go 70 yards with it. And Washington, obviously, Dylan Johnson, I didn't really know he was capable of some of those big plays, and he probably isn't against better defenses. But no, I mean, if they are just tackling well and not having any secondary breakdowns or anything like that, then this could hit the under at the very least, because there won't be many possessions. But
good point.
But no, I always feel like I'm trying to talk everybody into an upset by pointing out how it could happen when I don't think it's going to happen. But USC still got a lot of talent, and you're right. If there's a shot in the arm, if nothing else, from watching your DC get fired, maybe that they make a couple extra plays on defense too.
I don't want to jump to the conclusion that if SC loses and then they will be eliminated, then that Caleb Williams wouldn't play in whatever bowl game USC might go to. I mean, Bryce Young, Will Anderson both played in the bowl game last year against conventional wisdom. Pete, you know this situation pretty well. How would you characterize your expectation if SC, doesn't make it to the Pac-12 championship game, doesn't make it to one of the biggest bowls? I think it's highly unlikely that he would play in whatever bowl that they go to. Am I right in that perception?
So I have not dangled that notion yet to anyone at SC or anyone in Williams's camp. I would think like there's some bottom line business here that it would make sense that you don't do it. Again, their bowl variance could be pretty high, right? Like they could end up in a New Year's Six bowl if they have a couple positive results going out, and they could end up in some sort of second tier bowl as well. Bowl assignments are not my expertise, so I'm not going to sit there and spout out, is it holiday, is it this? That's all.
I think really, I think the line of delineation is sort of New Year's Six or not. Yeah. I mean, for a guy like this, right?
Yes,
I mean,
I would think so. I would think so. I don't think, again, USC is in a slump, and Caleb is now in the white hot lamp of will he be the number one pick, and things are being picked apart about him and his game. I think when we take a breath in late January, I think he remains the clear number one pick in this NFL draft. That is where I am, and that is where most NFL people are. There are always some wise guys like, and again, Drake May's had a really nice season. I don't think Drake May has had this authoritative takeover that one spot type season. I think he's been very good. Mm-hmm. I think he'll be a high pick. It's not a knock on him. I just don't think he's done enough and planted his flag enough. And I think the difference for Caleb is that he really fits the archetype of the hyper athletic modern quarterback who can beat you with his legs, throw at all the different arm angles. He just has a little bit more diversity to his game that separates him from May, who's excellent. And I think he'll be a great pro and I'll start for a long time. So I don't want this to take as like I'm hating on Drake May, but when you start splitting hairs between those two, I haven't seen enough this season to where to where Drake May has done enough to take over. Now, there are some scouts who like him more. And if you are like a Justin Herbert enthusiast and you like the Parcellsian mold of the big drop back quarterback, and May has a little scoot to him. I mean, there's some athleticism. He's not, I don't want to paint him.
I think he's got a lot. He just doesn't have a lot of, not as much wiggle. I would characterize him more like, I don't think he's quite as big as Andrew Luck, but sort of an Andrew Luck type of athleticism. You know,
Andrew could run.
He's fast.
Yeah.
He can run.
Yes.
He can. Andrew could really run. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But I also don't think you're going to have, him running read plays either in the NFL, right? Drake May. Like, I don't see that. Maybe I'm wrong. Bill's smirking.
No.
I'm just smirking because never underestimate the ability of anonymous NFL scouts to completely overthink from January to April, and like Joe Milton will end up number one all over again or something. But but no, I would right now. I think I would lean towards Caleb at least. I really like Drake May though.
Yeah, he's great. So
I think that's a win-win situation, to be honest.
Yes.
I mean, nobody's gonna be sad with either of those two guys and for a long time. I don't think, despite the fact, assuming that Washington has righted the ship and doesn't play as it did against Arizona State and really against Stanford, I don't give Utah much of a shot of going in there and beating them. Nor do I give TCU much of a shot at taking down Texas. And, TCU has always dreamed of supplanting Texas, right? That's sort of your lot in life as one of the other schools in the Lone Star State. And TCU is on the verge of doing that because the last team to play for a national championship and then not be bowl eligible the next year was Texas. And now TCU is staring in the face of its sixth loss of the season when the Longhorns come to town on Saturday. It would salvage TCU's season, and I don't see any way in the world it could happen. Although Texas certainly messed around against Houston in a passion play type of situation.
Yeah, I want to know what Bill thinks of our bet. Bill, Rece and I on our pod earlier this week made a friendly dinner wager. We're prone to these occasionally, as you know. Rece paid his off last year from basketball season at a steakhouse in Houston, where they get paid off whoever loses this time again. I took like Texas basically losing one of the last four games, like just basically saying that Texas does not get in the playoff. They fall down an elevator shaft, to use Rece Davis phraseology. And Rece's take to lead the pod early this week was Texas clinched a playoff spot, and they just have to play out the string. Who do you think made the wiser wager, Bill?
I think right now odds still favor them losing. Just don't ask me to who. It's one of those things where they're double-digit favorites. I have them projected by double digits in all three, TCU, Iowa State, and Texas Tech, and they'll probably be a comfortable favorite against OSU, but you add all those odds up together and it's still like only a 48% chance to get into 11-1. Then you add on, I keep saying Oklahoma State in my, like when I'm writing, I keep thinking they've already clinched. They obviously have not, but whoever they play in that game, it would still be like kind of a 60-40, 70-30 kind of odds. So yeah, I mean, if you get past Iowa State next week, I don't think it'd be pretty funny if they lost at home to Texas Tech to finish the year. Because
They did lose to Texas Tech last year.
I was going to say because they go 6 for 8 on fourth downs again or whatever. But
they were throwing tortillas though too, and that distracted them.
That's right. It'll be harder to do that.
God bless college football and throwing tortillas. You can't make this up.
But no, I mean, right now, I do think they're still more likely to finish with 2 losses than 1. It's just going to be somebody's going to actually have to take them down. And Kansas State sure had a shot at that the other day and dropped the ball. Literally.
You know what, Bill? My theory on it is this. I think Texas is really good. I'm not saying that I think they're great and better than everybody else and can't possibly lose. My theory on this is rhythm of the season. And they have escaped twice. And a lot of times when the chances come along and you don't trip up went to use the other metaphor, Pete, when you don't step on the rake and it doesn't hit you, or maybe you step on it and you realize you step on it and you move your head, then it misses. That's happened twice now. Houston and Kansas State. Now the caveat, and I'll still pay the bet if I lose. Obviously, if what can we have? We could still have Florida State, Georgia, Michigan, and Washington undefeated. I'll still pay the bet if they don't make it, but that would be the caveat. More clearly, they wouldn't make the playoff. But assuming that we don't have that, and then you can also, it would put them ahead of Alabama if Alabama's in the mix the last weekend. That's where I'm coming from. I think they've been very fortunate to dodge the disaster twice, because in my heart of hearts, I know if Houston had scored, I know Dana was going to go for two. And I saw that movie before when he was at West Virginia, and he was going to get it again, and they were going to lose if not for that bad third down spot. And then Saturday, Kansas State, as you alluded, they should have had him. They came back. Texas probably should have put the game away, but they came back and they should have had him, and they didn't. So that's. I think
there are a few extra special team periods in Manhattan this week.
Yeah, maybe so. Exactly. So you dodged the rake handle on the right, you dodged it on the left, and now I think you've got. I would say, even though I don't think they're suited to beat them, that trip to Ames, if it's cold and nasty, if
it's cold and nasty, that Iowa State secondary is really, really good. And whether it's, I assume Ewers is back by then, but I guess we'll see how this all plays out. But he can still be baited into mistakes occasionally, and Iowa State is pretty good at the bait. So I think between getting absolute home run swings from Texas, or from TCU and Texas Tech, which probably will be, not enough, but they're going to get those teams A games. They'll probably get Iowa State's A game too. I really do think it's, from a poetry standpoint, Mike Gundy being the first one out saying, well, they can leave. I don't care. We don't need them here. And then beating both OU and Texas to keep them both out of the college football playoff this year. There's some poetry. There's some poetry to that. But it's still, they're going to be favored in all those games. And if they play their A game, it probably won't matter.
Gundy might retire and go on the rattlesnake hunting circuit after the bowl game if he does that. Just, right. Well, the old George Costanza, walk off on a high note. If he does that, I don't know what else you're going to do there. He might. How about this? I just show Pete often talks about how crazy this sport is, and it is. This week, reading back through some stuff and coming across that note I mentioned earlier about, TCU national championship game, and then next year maybe not going to a bowl. Kirk Bowles, long-time reporter in Austin, knows all things connected to Texas, had written a story previously that Texas athletic director Chris Del Conte wanted to hire Sonny Dykes. Yeah. The name wasn't big enough for prominent Texas boosters, and Texas, of course, denies this. And the boosters wanted Sark. Ultimately, Sark got the job. And whoever last year preferred Steve Sarkisian to Sonny Dykes, looked sort of like a moron. And then you flip it 1 year, and now they look like Albert Einstein. Like, oh, yeah, we had Sark all along. And the variance and the difficulties of making the right coaching hire, and then once you make it, if you have success maintaining it, or if you don't have as much success as you'd hoped early, turning it around is really, really a remarkable thing.
And the god of close games just laughs at all of us in every possible way, because TCU got all the breaks last year, hasn't gotten any this year. Texas was like 2-4, 2-5 each of the last couple seasons in one-score games. Now they're getting the breaks. So much of this just comes down to when it's kind of your turn to get the breaks, and Texas has certainly timed their breaks pretty well this year.
Running an athletic department and making these decisions is investing in crypto, not bonds. It is prone to volatility.
There's no job I want less. There's no job I want less than athletic.
Nick Saban is the only one who has been averse to a financial slump, basically the last 20 years, right? Like that, you could maybe argue a few other brands have, done that, but like there is variance. There will be variance unless you are in that top 50% of 1%, right? Like I just, there is just going to be variance, which makes it beautiful, a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful mess with vacuum cleaners on the porch.
Hey, how's your vacuum cleaner running, Bill? Is it okay?
Oh, we're good. We got one of those expensive ones a few years ago, so we're fine. We got a ways before we have to worry about one.
If something goes wrong, I know a guy.
Yeah, maybe. I'm curious. A lot of things. We'll see. Well, I'm not convinced of what was going on there, but who knows? Who knows?
You might have to pay for shipping and handling, but
yes.
I'm not sure how that works. But maybe we can get you in contact with a guy. Guys, one last thing I want to say before we get out of here. James Madison appealing to the NCAA again about having the transition period reduced and allowing them. And I believe the Sun Belt said that, if they get relief, that they're going to let them play in the championship game. This is the chance. The NCAA can't solve every problem that faces college athletics, and they certainly can't satisfy the people involved. Here's your chance to do one thing that everybody understands is the right thing, that everybody understands is good for your brand. It's good for James Madison. It's good for the players. It's good for the conference. It's good for everybody. There is no downside to this. They've done it differently than the other transition schools. They didn't play their first year in FCS. They've proven that they can compete. I'm begging you, do the right thing. Make it easy. Just take the PR win. They're handing you a PR win. Take it. Take it and say thank you, and watch the goodwill that you engender. Guys, great job here today. As always, Pete and I will be back with Stanford Steve on Friday to make our picks. Thanks for listening to the College Game Day podcast. We ask you to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you prefer downloading it each time, just go ahead and download wherever it is you like to get your podcast. And good luck keeping your vacuum cleaners in good working order.